The fluorescent lights of the Pentagon's West Wing hummed their eternal song, casting sterile white across polished floors that reflected 1,000 anonymous faces each day. Admiral Marcus Thornton had walked these corridors for 3 decades, his chest heavy with ribbons that told stories most men couldn't fathom. He'd overseen operations in 13 countries, commanded carrier strike groups, and earned the respect of warriors who knew what it meant to bleed for the flag. But on this particular Thursday evening, as rain drummed against bulletproof windows, he found himself irritated by something trivial: a recycling bin positioned 2 inches from where regulations specified. The janitor pushing the cleaning cart wore the same navy blue uniform as a dozen others who worked the swing shift. Unremarkable, forgettable. The name stitched above the breast pocket read Morgan. No rank, no ribbons, just a person society had trained him not to see. Thornton watched as Morgan moved with unexpected precision, corners squared, movements economical. There was something in the posture, something he couldn't quite place. Military bearing, perhaps, or just exhaustion from a long shift. The Admiral approached with the casual arrogance of a man who'd forgotten what it meant to be questioned. "You prior service?" Thornton asked, his tone carrying that peculiar mix of curiosity and condescension that senior officers reserve for civilians they suspect once wore the uniform. Morgan paused mid-motion, one hand still gripping the mop handle. Dark eyes met the Admiral's gaze with a steadiness that seemed almost inappropriate given the disparity in their current stations. "Yes, sir. Long time ago." "What branch?" Thornton leaned against the wall, blocking the corridor in that unconscious way powerful men occupy space they consider theirs by right. "Navy, sir. Rotary wing." The answer came flat, emotionless, as if discussing someone else's life entirely. Thornton smiled, the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes. He'd flown FA-18s off the Eisenhower, felt the catapult launch slam his spine, experienced the godlike rush of breaking sound barriers. Helicopter pilots were something else, bus drivers of the sky, as the fighter jocks said at the O Club. Helicopters, must have been some career path. The mockery sat light on his tongue. "Tell you what, humor an old Admiral. What was your call sign?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a discharged weapon. Morgan's grip on the mop handle shifted slightly, knuckles showing white for just a moment before relaxing. Outside, the rain intensified, thunder rolling across Arlington like distant artillery. When Morgan finally spoke, the words came quiet, almost swallowed by the building's ambient noise. "Night Eagle, sir." The Admiral's smile froze, then cracked like ice over deep water. The Pentagon's West Wing suddenly felt smaller, the walls pressing in as Admiral Thornton's mind raced backward through classified briefings and after-action reports he'd signed, but never fully absorbed. Night Eagle. The call sign surfaced from memory like a submarine breaking through dark waves, bringing with it fragments of stories whispered in ready rooms and intelligence cells. Stories he'd dismissed as embellished legends, the kind of myths that grow around special operations when facts get buried under classification stamps. "Say that again," Thornton said, his voice stripped of its earlier condescension. The Admiral's posture shifted infinitesimally, shoulders back, chin slightly down, a fighter pilot's instinctive response to threat assessment. Morgan set the mop into the bucket with deliberate care, water sloshing quietly. "Night Eagle, sir. I flew MH-60s. Search and rescue mostly. Some other things." The understatement landed heavy, pregnant with everything left unsaid. Morgan's eyes held steady, neither challenging nor submissive, just present with the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst moments life offers. Thornton's hand moved unconsciously to his chest, fingers brushing the ribbons there. Among them was the Navy Cross, earned over the Persian Gulf when his Super Hornet took shrapnel, and he'd brought it home on failing hydraulics. He'd thought himself intimate with courage. But Night Eagle, that name appeared in documentation so classified he'd needed 3 separate security clearances just to see the file headers, reports from JSOC operations. Missions where the word covert didn't even begin to cover the darkness they'd operated within. Afghanistan, Thornton said, not quite a question. 2011, the Kunar Valley extraction. Something flickered across Morgan's face, there and gone like muzzle flash in darkness. Among other places, sir. The corridor felt like it was tilting. Thornton remembered that briefing, the one that had arrived at 300 on a Tuesday, pulling him from sleep into a SCIF where grainy helmet camera footage showed a helicopter dancing through tracer fire like a leaf in a hurricane. 12 SEALs trapped on a ridge, surrounded, ammunition critical, medevac impossible according to every conventional tactical assessment. Then Night Eagle had appeared on infrared, a ghost made of metal and will, defying physics and probability in equal measure. You went in under the coverage ceiling, Thornton heard himself say, his voice distant, as if someone else was speaking through him. They said it was impossible. Every pilot we consulted said the downdrafts and enemy fire made it a suicide run, but someone went anyway. Morgan nodded once, a small movement that acknowledged history without claiming glory. They needed extraction, sir. Everything else was secondary. The Admiral's throat felt tight. He'd signed commendations for that operation, written the awards in sterile military prose that transformed blood and terror into bureaucratic language. But he'd never met the pilot. Thornton's mind cataloged the person before him with new eyes, seeing past the janitor's uniform to the warrior beneath. Morgan couldn't have been more than 5'6", slight build, the kind of frame that looked fragile until you noticed the coiled strength in the forearms, the way weight balanced on the balls of the feet. Ready, always ready. The Admiral's gaze caught on Morgan's hands, scarred across the knuckles, one finger slightly crooked as if it had healed wrong after being broken. Working hands now, pushing mops and emptying trash. But once they'd gripped cyclic controls during the kind of flying that turned other pilots' blood to ice water. Why are you here? The question emerged raw, almost accusatory. Thornton gestured at the cleaning cart, the mop bucket, the institutional hallway that reeked of disinfectant and forgotten dreams. Why aren't you still flying? Why aren't you teaching at Whiting Field or Pensacola, passing on what you know? Morgan's expression shifted into something that might have been a smile if it contained any warmth. Medical discharge, sir, 2013. Took some damage during an op outside Kandahar, spine compression, inner ear problems. Can't hold a flight physical anymore. The words came factual, stripped of self-pity, just reality accepted and integrated. Still needed to eat, still had a kid to raise. This job has decent health insurance, doesn't ask too many questions, and lets me keep a roof overhead. The casual mention of a child hit Thornton like a frag grenade detonating inside his chest. He'd assumed a certain narrative, the lone wolf warrior, the operator who lived for the mission. But Morgan was a parent, someone who traded the cockpit for a mop handle because survival demanded it, because love required sacrifice in ways that had nothing to do with medals or glory. Your kid, Thornton said carefully, aware he was treading on personal ground his rank gave him no right to explore. They know what you did. Morgan shook her head. She. The Admiral suddenly registered the pronoun with crystalline clarity, realizing his assumptions had been wrong from the first moment. He's 12. Thinks I flew helicopters for the Navy, helped people, which is true far as it goes, doesn't need to know the rest, doesn't need those nightmares. Rain continued its percussion against the windows, nature's artillery providing soundtrack to a conversation that felt increasingly unmoored from the mundane reality of cleaning schedules and security protocols. Thornton found himself grappling with a cognitive dissonance that made his head ache. The Pentagon hummed with its evening rhythm, reduced staff moving through corridors where decisions affecting millions were made daily. Admiral Thornton stood motionless, aware that something fundamental had shifted in his understanding of the world. Morgan returned to mopping, the rhythmic swish of wet fibers against tile creating a meditative soundtrack that seemed to underscore the gulf between reputation and reality, between the stories men tell and the truths women live. "How many missions?" Thornton asked, his voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking louder might shatter whatever fragile connection had formed between them. "How many times did you fly into hell when everyone else said it was impossible?" Morgan didn't look up from her work, focus seemingly absorbed by a scuff mark that refused to yield to chemical and friction. "Does it matter, sir? The people who needed to know knew. The operators I pulled out, they remember. That's enough." But it wasn't enough, Thornton realized. It wasn't nearly enough. He'd spent 3 decades in a service that prided itself on honor and recognition, where ribbons and ranks told the world exactly where you stood in the hierarchy of courage. Yet here was someone who'd earned a place in that pantheon through actions that would never appear in any public record, whose service had been deliberately erased to protect operational security and political deniability. "The Cunnar Valley extraction," Thornton pressed, unable to let it go. "The after-action report said the pilot took 14 hits, hydraulic line severed, tail rotor damaged, one engine running at 60% capacity, but you still made 3 trips up to that ridge, 3 separate insertions under enemy fire to pull everyone out." Morgan's hand stilled on the mop handle. For a long moment she stood perfectly motionless, and Thornton recognized the stillness of someone who'd learned to disappear into themselves, to find calm in the center of chaos. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of memory, thick and dark as oil. "The last seal weighed 220. Had to leave my co-pilot's seat empty to make weight fly it solo. Took a round through the canopy on final approach, glass everywhere. Could barely see the LZ through the blood." She paused, seeming to surface from somewhere deep and distant. "But we got them home, all of them. That's what mattered." Thornton felt something crack inside his chest, some calcified assumption about valor and visibility, about who deserved recognition and who got relegated to the shadows. He'd flown missions where the risks were calculated, where support networks surrounded him, where glory waited on the other side of survival. Morgan had flown into voids where death was the expected outcome and anonymity was guaranteed regardless of success or failure. "I need to see your file," Thornton said, pulling out his phone, already composing a message to his aide. "Your full service record. There has to be documentation, awards that were processed, commendations that went through channels." Morgan finally looked up, and the expression on her face made the Admiral's fingers freeze over his phone's screen. It was pity, he realized with a shock. She was looking at him with pity, as if he were a child still believing in fairy tales about justice and merit. "Sir, with respect, most of my file is redacted or sealed. What isn't classified doesn't tell the story you're looking for. I flew missions that officially never happened, supported operations that still don't exist in any public record. The awards I received can't be worn on any uniform because acknowledging them would compromise sources and methods." Morgan's voice remained gentle but firm. "I made peace with that a long time ago. The recognition was never the point." The words hit Thornton like a physical blow, forcing him to confront the uncomfortable truth that the military he'd served with such pride operated on multiple levels, and the level where real operators functioned bore little resemblance to the sterile ceremonies and press releases he'd participated in. Morgan had existed in the gaps between official history and classified reality, and those gaps had consumed her without leaving a trace. "Then let me help now," Thornton said, hearing the desperation in his own voice and not caring. "You shouldn't be pushing a mop. You should be—" "Should be what, sir?" Morgan interrupted quietly. "Should be flying helicopters I'm medically prohibited from operating. Should be teaching at a school that requires a current flight physical. Should be consulting for defense contractors who want someone to sign NDAs and never speak about the only things that make me qualified." She shook her head slowly. "I appreciate the sentiment, but this is my life now. I've made it work." The Admiral opened his mouth to protest, to argue that surely something could be done, some exception made, some recognition granted. But Morgan had already returned to mopping, the conversation clearly over as far as she was concerned. Thornton stood there, a man who commanded carrier strike groups and advised the Joint Chiefs, rendered impotent by the simple reality that rank meant nothing in the face of medical disqualification and operational security. He watched Morgan work her way down the corridor, the cleaning cart's wheels squeaking rhythmically against the polished floor. Each movement was efficient, practiced, the same economy of motion that had once guided a helicopter through impossible situations. She'd learned to apply warrior discipline to civilian tasks, turning janitorial work into something executed with the same precision she'd once brought to combat flying. Thornton pulled out his phone again, this time scrolling through contacts until he found the name he needed. Captain Jennifer Reese, his aide, someone he trusted with classified information and sensitive operations. His thumbs moved across the screen, composing a message that felt simultaneously necessary and futile. Need full service record for Morgan. No last name yet, we'll get it. Former Navy MH-60 pilot, call sign Night Eagle. Medical discharge 2013. Pull everything we can access. JSOC operations, commendations, after-action reports. Need this yesterday. Also want list of opportunities for medically retired personnel with her clearance level and experience. The message sent with a soft whoosh, disappearing into the digital ether to begin its journey through bureaucratic channels. Thornton knew it might take days or weeks to assemble the information, assuming it could be accessed at all. Morgan was right about the redactions, about the sealed files and operations that existed only in the memories of people who'd been there. But standing in that corridor, watching a warrior reduced to janitorial work, the Admiral made a decision that transcended bureaucracy and classification levels. Whatever Morgan had done in those valleys and over those deserts, whoever she'd saved during missions that would never be publicly acknowledged, she deserved better than this. Better than fluorescent lights and mop buckets, better than invisibility and forgotten service. Morgan reached the end of the corridor and turned the corner, disappearing from view. The Admiral remained standing there, alone with his thoughts and the rain that continued to hammer against the Pentagon's fortified walls. Somewhere in the building above him, generals and admirals were planning operations, moving pieces on global chessboards, deciding which warriors would be sent into harm's way. But down here, in the maintenance corridors and service spaces, the warriors who'd already been spent moved silently through their second acts, their stories locked behind classification stamps and medical disqualifications. Thornton's phone buzzed, Captain Reese responding with characteristic efficiency. On it. Preliminary search shows extensive JSOC involvement, multiple deployments, high-level clearances. File access is complicated. We'll have update within 48 hours. Are we looking at reinstatement possibilities? The Admiral's thumbs hovered over the keyboard. Was that what he was doing? Trying to fix something that couldn't be fixed, to resurrect a career that had been legitimately ended by physical limitations? Or was he simply trying to ensure that Morgan's service, however classified, received the internal recognition it deserved even if public acknowledgement remained impossible? Not reinstatement, he typed back. Recognition, an opportunity. Someone with her experience and clearances should be doing more than cleaning floors. There has to be something. 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. Finally, understood, will explore options. Thornton pocketed his phone and started walking, his footsteps echoing in the empty corridor. He'd missed his dinner reservation, forgotten about the briefing materials he'd meant to review tonight. None of it seemed important anymore. He passed other janitors, other invisible people who kept the Pentagon functioning, while admirals and generals claimed credit for victories built on foundations most of them never acknowledged. How many others were there, he wondered. How many warriors had transitioned to civilian work after injuries or medical discharges, their stories buried under classification stamps, their contributions reduced to file numbers and redacted text? The Admiral's mind drifted back to that briefing in 2011, the grainy footage of Night Eagle extracting those seals from the ridge. He'd watched it twice, studying the flying with a fighter pilot's critical eye, and even then he'd been awed by the precision and courage displayed. The helicopter had seemed almost alive, responding to terrain and threats with an intelligence that suggested perfect unity between machine and pilot. He'd never considered that the pilot might be a woman. It shouldn't matter. Women had been flying Navy helicopters for decades, proving themselves repeatedly in combat and peacetime operations. But Thornton recognized his own unconscious bias, the automatic assumption that extreme valor looked a certain way, sounded a certain way, presented itself in accordance with images Hollywood had burned into his brain. Morgan had shattered that assumption simply by existing, by being both extraordinary warrior and ordinary parent, by accepting invisibility with the same discipline she'd once brought to impossible missions. The rain had stopped by the time Thornton reached his office on the E-Ring, the prestigious outer corridor where the Pentagon's most senior leadership maintained their spaces. His office was decorated with the standard symbols of military achievement, photos with presidents and foreign dignitaries, plaques commemorating successful operations, shadow boxes displaying ribbons and medals. The trappings of a career spent in the light, where valor was photographed and recognition was formalized through ceremonies and documentation. He sank into his leather chair, expensive and comfortable, everything Morgan's work life wasn't. On his desk sat the briefing materials for tomorrow's meeting about the Pacific Fleet posture, documents outlining strategies for projecting American power across contested waters. Important work, essential work, but suddenly it all felt abstract, disconnected from the reality of actual operators who flew actual missions and bore actual costs. Thornton opened his laptop and pulled up the classified network, typing Night Eagle into the search field. The results populated slowly, each file requiring multiple authentication protocols. He clicked through them methodically, reading every scrap of accessible information, piecing together a career from fragments and redactions. Afghan operations, 17 months of deployment across 3 tours. Casualty evacuation missions numbered in the dozens, each one flying into hot zones where the risk assessments recommended against insertion. Special operations support, multiple classified missions supporting SEAL and Delta teams, providing extraction capabilities in environments considered too dangerous for standard aviation assets. Awards and commendations, Navy Cross classified ceremony, citation sealed. 3 distinguished flying crosses, Purple Heart, Air Medal with Valor device, and a list of other ribbons that spoke to sustained excellence under fire. The citations, even redacted, painted a picture of someone who turned impossible into routine, who developed a reputation among special operators as the pilot who would come get you regardless of conditions, regardless of risk. In a community that prided itself on never leaving anyone behind, Night Eagle had been the insurance policy that made that promise credible. Thornton read deeper, finding medical reports from the final mission. Morgan had taken shrapnel from an RPG that detonated too close to her aircraft during an emergency extraction outside Kandahar. The explosion had damaged the helicopter's tail section and sent fragments through the fuselage, several pieces finding Morgan's back and neck. She'd held the damaged aircraft together long enough to reach friendly territory, set it down despite failing hydraulics and partial loss of tail rotor authority, then collapsed on the tarmac while her crew chief screamed for medics. The injuries had been severe but not immediately life-threatening. Spinal compression fractures, soft tissue damage, and most career-ending, damage to the inner ear structures that governed balance and spatial orientation. For a pilot who'd built expertise around flying in degraded visual environments and complex terrain, losing reliable vestibular function was equivalent to a sniper losing their vision. Technically survivable, but professionally fatal. The medical discharge paperwork was clinical, devoid of emotion. Service member is permanently disqualified from aviation duties due to vestibular dysfunction secondary to combat injury. Recommend administrative separation with full benefits. Full benefits. The phrase sat like ash in Thornton's mouth. Benefits meant health care and a modest pension, enough to survive but not enough to thrive, especially not for a single parent raising a child in one of America's most expensive regions. Morgan had traded a career of extraordinary achievement for a job that paid $15 an hour, all because she'd done exactly what the Navy had trained her to do: sacrifice everything for the mission. The Admiral's fingers drummed against his desk, mind working through possibilities and protocols. There had to be options for someone with Morgan's clearances and experience. Intelligence consulting, training development, operational planning, roles that valued tactical knowledge without requiring active flight status. But those positions typically went to people with connections, people who knew how to navigate the complex ecosystem of defense contractors and government agencies. Morgan, it seemed, had prioritized anonymity over opportunity, chosen the simple path of hourly wages and invisibility rather than leverage her service for personal gain. In a city full of former officers who parlayed their experience into six-figure consulting contracts, her choice stood out as both admirable and tragic. Thornton composed another message to Captain Reese. Want Morgan connected with career counseling services specifically for special operations veterans. Also pull list of cleared positions suitable for tactical aviation expertise, but not requiring active flight status. Looking for opportunities that match her skill level, not charity. His phone buzzed almost immediately. Define skill level for search parameters. The Admiral paused, considering how to quantify someone who'd operated at the absolute apex of their profession, who'd been trusted with the lives of the nation's most elite warriors during their most desperate moments. Finally, he typed, Tier 1 operator level, Joint Special Operations Command caliber, someone who advised and supported teams at the highest classification levels. A longer pause this time before Reese responded. That's a very small pool of opportunities. Most positions at that level are already filled by well-connected veterans. Will search but want to manage expectations. Thornton understood the subtext. Morgan's greatest asset, her classified service record, was also her greatest liability. She couldn't discuss her most impressive achievements in job interviews, couldn't use her most significant accomplishments as leverage for better positions. The same operational security that had kept her alive during missions now imprisoned her in anonymity afterward. The office felt claustrophobic suddenly, walls pressing in with the weight of systemic failures and institutional blindness. Thornton stood, packing to the window that overlooked the Pentagon's central courtyard. Rain had given way to clear skies, stars emerging between gaps in the cloud cover. Morgan was somewhere out there, probably finishing her shift, maybe heading home to her 12-year-old son who didn't know his mother was a legend among warriors who specialized in the impossible. The Admiral pressed his palm against the cold glass, watching his breath fog the window. He'd built his career on principles of honor and leadership, on the belief that the Navy took care of its own. But standing there, confronting the reality of Morgan's circumstances, those principles felt hollow. The Navy had taken what it needed from her, years of service, physical health, peace of mind, and then discarded her with bureaucratic efficiency when she could no longer serve in her primary role. The system wasn't designed to be cruel, Thornton understood. It was simply indifferent, processing thousands of service members through medical discharge procedures without capacity for individual consideration of what those people had contributed or sacrificed. Morgan was a statistic, one name among many in separation paperwork, her extraordinary service reduced to checkbox categories and standardized forms. His phone buzzed again. Captain Reese found something interesting. Defense Intelligence Agency has a program for wounded injured special operations veterans, consulting work on operational planning and threat assessment. Pays well, values specialized knowledge, heavy clearance requirements. Might be perfect fit. Want me to make inquiries? Thornton's pulse quickened. Yes, discreetly, don't want to create pressure or obligation, just want to ensure she knows the opportunity exists. Understood. Will approach through veteran services channels rather than directly. The Admiral nodded to himself, satisfied that at least something was happening, some wheels were turning. But even as he felt relief, he recognized the uncomfortable truth that this was reactive, addressing one individual case rather than the systemic issues that had created the problem. How many other Morgans were out there, washing floors and emptying trash, their service forgotten or deliberately obscured? Thornton returned to his desk and pulled up a blank document, beginning to draft a memo to the Chief of Naval Personnel. The writing came slowly, each word weighted with the responsibility of translating Morgan's story into policy recommendations without compromising her operational security. He wrote about the need for better career transition services for special operations personnel, about creating pathways that valued specialized knowledge, even when physical limitations prevented continued active service. The memo grew to 3 pages, then 5, then 7. Thornton wrote about the moral obligation to ensure that warriors who'd served at the highest levels didn't fall through bureaucratic cracks, about the strategic necessity of retaining tactical knowledge within the military intelligence community rather than letting it dissipate into civilian obscurity. He wrote carefully, aware that suggesting the system had failed would encounter resistance from administrators who'd built careers within that system. By the time he finished, midnight had passed and the Pentagon's corridors had gone silent except for the custodial staff working their nocturnal rounds. Thornton saved the document, scheduled it for additional review tomorrow when his mind was fresher, and shut down his computer. The day had started ordinarily, just another Thursday in a career composed of routine decisions and procedural necessities. It was ending with his understanding of service and recognition fundamentally altered. The Admiral gathered his belongings and left his office, walking through corridors still smelling of industrial cleaner and floor wax. Somewhere in this vast building, Morgan was probably finishing her shift, checking off the last items on tonight's cleaning list, preparing to return to whatever modest apartment she shared with her son. Thornton wondered if she ever thought about those missions, about the SEALs and Delta operators whose lives she'd saved, about the times she'd pushed damaged aircraft beyond their design limitations through sheer skill and determination. Or had she compartmentalized it all, sealed those memories away like the classified files that documented her service? He reached the parking garage and climbed into his official vehicle, a black SUV with government plates and enough security features to withstand most small arms fire. The contrast with Morgan's circumstances couldn't have been more stark. Him driving home to a comfortable house in McLean, her probably taking public transportation to somewhere far less prestigious. Both had served, both had sacrificed, but the outcomes reflected an inequality that had nothing to do with merit and everything to do with timing, injury, and bureaucratic indifference. The drive home passed in contemplative silence, Thornton's mind replaying the conversation in the corridor, analyzing Morgan's careful responses and deliberate understatements. She'd been protecting something, he realized, not operational security, but her own dignity. The last thing she wanted was pity from an admiral who'd stumbled across her diminished circumstances, who saw her current work as somehow beneath the warrior she'd once been. Morgan had already grieved the loss of her flying career, had already made peace with trading the cockpit for a mop handle. She didn't need his salvation or his guilt. But Thornton couldn't let it go, couldn't simply return to his normal routine and forget what he'd learned. The system had failed Morgan, and his position gave him responsibility to address that failure even if she herself had moved past it. Tomorrow he would continue making inquiries, pulling bureaucratic levers, trying to create opportunities that might restore some measure of the professional respect Morgan deserved. Tonight, though, he simply drove through the dark suburbs, past houses where other veterans lived their own second acts, carried on their own silent struggles with injuries and memories, and the gap between service rendered and recognition received. The rain had returned, soft and steady, washing over Arlington like tears the city would never acknowledge. Admiral Thornton gripped the steering wheel and made a silent promise to a warrior who'd asked for nothing. Your story won't be forgotten, not by me, not while I have the power to ensure it matters. The next morning arrived cold and clear, winter asserting itself over the nation's capital with frost that turned the Potomac's banks crystalline. Admiral Thornton rose at 500 as always, habit carved deep by decades of military discipline, and went through his morning routine with mechanical precision. But his mind remained fixed on the previous night's encounter, on Morgan's calm acceptance of circumstances that should have been unacceptable, on the vast machinery of bureaucracy that had processed her out of service without recognizing the extraordinary nature of what she'd contributed. Over breakfast, alone in his kitchen while his wife slept upstairs, Thornton reviewed the memo he drafted. The words looked different in morning light, simultaneously urgent and insufficient, passionate but bound by the constraints of military formality. He made revisions, strengthening recommendations while softening criticisms, walking the careful line between advocacy and insubordination. The Navy didn't reward admirals who suggested fundamental flaws in how it managed personnel, but it also prided itself on learning and adaptation. Thornton had to thread that needle perfectly if he wanted the memo to create change rather than career damage. By 6:30, he was in his vehicle navigating morning traffic toward the Pentagon. The facility emerged from dawn mist like a fortress, its 5 concentric rings housing the sprawling apparatus of American military power. Thornton had worked here long enough to see past the symbolism to the reality. Thousands of people, military and civilian, processing information and making decisions that rippled across the globe. Somewhere in those rings, Morgan would arrive for another shift, clock in, collect her cleaning supplies, and begin work that utilized perhaps 1% of her actual capabilities. The Admiral parked in his reserved spot and entered through the river entrance, badging through security with the ease of someone whose face the guards had long since memorized. He took the stairs rather than the elevator, old habit from his days as a junior officer trying to stay fit despite desk assignments. The E-ring corridor stretched before him, portraits of former Navy leaders watching with painted eyes that seemed to judge whether current occupants measured up to historical standards. His aide, Captain Reese, was already at her desk when Thornton entered the outer office. She looked up from her computer, expression neutral, but eyes sharp with the intelligence that had made her invaluable over 3 years of working together. "Good morning, Admiral. I have updates on the Morgan situation." Thornton nodded, hanging his uniform jacket on the office coat rack before settling into his chair. "Go ahead." Reese consulted her notes, though Thornton suspected she had most of the information memorized. Full name is Morgan Avery, Lieutenant Commander, retired. Medical discharge 2013 as previously established. Service record is heavily redacted, but what's accessible is remarkable. 7 years of operational flying, all of it in combat zones or high-threat environments. Became the go-to pilot for JSOC when missions required someone with exceptional skill and nerves. The call sign Night Eagle came from a Delta team leader, who said she could see in the dark better than night vision. "Family situation?" Thornton asked, though he was more focused on professional opportunities than personal circumstances. "Single mother. Son is 12, as she mentioned. Father is listed as unknown on birth certificate, which suggests either donor situation or a relationship she chose not to formalize. No current support network that I can identify, parents deceased, no siblings on record. She's been doing it alone since the discharge." The information settled over Thornton like a weight. Alone. Morgan had transitioned from combat operations to single parenthood without the support structures most people took for granted, had built a life from scratch while dealing with physical injuries, and the psychological aftermath of missions that would haunt anyone's dreams. And she'd done it all without complaint, without seeking special consideration, without leveraging her service for sympathy or advantage. The DIA opportunity, Thornton prompted. Reese's expression brightened slightly. Promising. The program is called Strategic Advisory Consultancy, basically a think tank composed of retired special operations personnel who provide operational planning input on sensitive missions. They value tactical knowledge and field experience over formal education. The clearance requirements are extensive, but Morgan meets them all. Pay scale ranges from GS-14 to GS-15 equivalent depending on expertise, which would be substantial improvement over janitorial wages. Have they been contacted? I reached out to the program director yesterday evening through back channels, explained we had a candidate with exceptional qualifications but complicated service history. He's interested and willing to conduct a preliminary interview if Morgan is amenable. Reese paused, choosing her next words carefully. The challenge is approach. If we simply hand her this opportunity, it might feel patronizing or create sense of obligation. She's clearly someone who values agency and autonomy. Thornton nodded slowly, appreciating Reese's insight. Morgan had spent her military career in roles where she controlled her own fate, where her skill determined outcomes. Swooping in like some beneficent admiral offering salvation would undermine that identity, reduce her to a victim needing rescue rather than a warrior deserving opportunity. Suggestions, he asked. The Veterans Transition Program runs quarterly career fairs where various agencies recruit for cleared positions. Next one is in 3 weeks. We could ensure DIA has a table, and that their recruiting materials specifically mention the Strategic Advisory Consultancy. We could also make sure Morgan receives a personalized invitation to attend, framed as routine outreach to all medically retired personnel with her clearance level. It was elegant, creating opportunity without applying pressure, opening a door without pushing anyone through it. Morgan would attend the fair, encounter the DIA recruiter naturally, and make her own choice about whether to pursue the position. No Admiral's influence, no sense of charity, just information and opportunity presented neutrally. Make it happen, Thornton said. And Captain, find out if there are other Morgans out there, other medically retired special operations personnel who might benefit from this kind of outreach. Let's turn this into a program, not just one individual intervention. Reese smiled, the kind of expression that suggested she'd already been thinking along those lines. Already compiling a list, sir. Preliminary search identified 47 Navy personnel medically retired over the past decade with JSOC operational experience. Majority are in situations similar to Morgan's, underemployed relative to their skills and clearances. The number hit Thornton like a punch. 47 warriors, just in the Navy alone, drifting through civilian life without adequate support or recognition. Multiply that across all services and the number became staggering. Hundreds or thousands of people who'd operated at the highest levels only to be processed out and forgotten when injuries ended their active careers. We need to do better, Thornton said quietly, speaking to himself as much as to Reese. These people gave us their best years, their health, their peace of mind. We owe them more than a pension and a thank you for your service. Yes, sir, Reese agreed. I'll coordinate with Navy Personnel Command to develop a more robust outreach program. In the meantime, Morgan will receive her invitation within the week. Thornton thanked his aide and turned to the day's official business, briefings on Pacific Fleet readiness, budgetary consultations, personnel decisions affecting thousands of sailors. Important work that demanded his full attention. But throughout the morning, his mind kept drifting back to that corridor, to Morgan pushing her cleaning cart with quiet dignity, to the realization that true service often happened in shadows, while recognition illuminated only the most visible achievements. During lunch, eaten at his desk while reviewing acquisition reports, Thornton allowed himself to imagine a different future. Morgan accepted the DIA position, found work that utilized her tactical knowledge and operational experience. She moved her son to better schools, built a professional network, regained the sense of purpose that came from contributing expertise rather than merely maintaining facilities. Other medically retired veterans followed similar paths, creating a pipeline from operational flying to strategic advisory roles that valued their sacrifices without requiring them to remain silent about their contributions. It was an optimistic vision, probably naive in its simplicity. But Thornton had spent 30 years in service learning that change started with individual actions, with admirals who chose to see janitors as warriors, with bureaucrats who prioritized people over procedures. Maybe this memo he drafted would catalyze something larger. Maybe Morgan's story would become the example that forced the Navy to reconsider how it supported personnel whose bodies failed but whose minds remained sharp and valuable. Or maybe nothing would change, and Morgan would continue pushing that mop until her son was grown and gone, until her own body finally gave out from years of pain poorly managed. The thought made Thornton's stomach clench with something uncomfortably close to shame. He'd worn the uniform for 3 decades, climbed to the highest ranks, earned the respect of peers and subordinates. But what good was any of it if the institution he'd served could discard someone like Morgan without recognizing what was being lost? The afternoon brought meetings that dragged on past their scheduled times, discussions about readiness metrics and maintenance schedules that felt increasingly distant from anything that mattered. Thornton participated with professional competence, his mind engaged but his heart elsewhere. Finally, at 1700, he escaped his office and made his way back to the West Wing corridors, following the route he'd walked the night before. Morgan was there, right on schedule, working her way methodically through the evening cleaning routine. She'd reached the section near the secure conference rooms, wiping down door handles and light switches with the careful attention that regulations demanded. Thornton watched from a distance, seeing her now as she truly was, not a janitor who happened to have military history, but a warrior forced into different uniform, applying tactical discipline to whatever mission presented itself. He approached slowly, not wanting to startle her, aware that people with combat experience sometimes reacted poorly to unexpected proximity. Morgan looked up as his footsteps echoed in the corridor, her expression neutral but wary, probably wondering if the Admiral had returned with more questions or unwelcome pity. "Lieutenant Commander Avery," Thornton said formally, using her rank deliberately. "I want to apologize for last night. I had no right to interrogate you about your service or express opinions about your current circumstances." Morgan straightened slightly, surprise flickering across her face before being suppressed. "No apology necessary, Admiral. You were just making conversation." "It was more than conversation, and we both know it," Thornton countered gently. "I was indulging my curiosity without considering how it might feel to be questioned about parts of your life you've chosen to leave behind. That was thoughtless, and I regret it." For a long moment, Morgan studied him with those calm, dark eyes that had seen things most people couldn't imagine. Finally, she nodded slightly. "Thank you, sir. That means something." The admission hung between them, an acknowledgement that despite her outward acceptance, the previous night's conversation had affected her, had stirred memories and emotions she'd worked hard to contain. Thornton felt the weight of that, the responsibility of having opened wounds that might have been healing. "For what it's worth," he continued, "you were the best kind of warrior. The kind who did the work without needing glory, who measured success by missions accomplished rather than medals earned. The Navy was lucky to have you, even if it didn't always recognize that." Morgan's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "The Navy gave me the opportunity to serve in ways I never imagined possible. Yes, the ending could have been better, but I got to fly incredible machines, support incredible people, and do work that mattered. That's more than most people get. I'm grateful for it, even if it ended with injuries and discharge. Her generosity toward an institution that had ultimately failed her made Thornton's throat tight. Here was someone who'd given everything and received inadequate return, yet she refused bitterness, refused to cast herself as victim. The strength required for that kind of grace exceeded anything measured by physical endurance or tactical skill. Your son, Thornton said carefully, he's lucky to have you as a parent, someone who understands sacrifice and service, who can teach him about commitment and resilience. He's a good kid, Morgan said, and for the first time Thornton heard genuine warmth in her voice, saw her expression shift from neutral professionalism to something softer. Smart, curious, thinks he might want to be an engineer someday. I'm just trying to give him stability and opportunities I didn't have growing up. The glimpse into her motivation, everything she did was for that 12-year-old boy, made Morgan's choices crystallize. The janitorial work wasn't defeat or failure. It was strategic decision-making, choosing reliable income and health insurance over less certain prospects that might have paid better but offered less security. She was still flying tactical missions, just with different metrics for success. Keep the lights on, food on table, kid healthy and educated. Those were her objectives now, and she pursued them with the same discipline that had once made her Night Eagle. Thornton found himself respecting her more in this moment than he had the night before, when the focus had been on past achievements and current diminishment. Morgan wasn't diminished at all. She'd simply redeployed her considerable strength toward different objectives, brought warrior discipline to the challenge of single parenthood in America's unforgiving economy. I won't keep you from your work, the Admiral said finally, stepping back. But thank you, Lieutenant Commander, for your service then, and for the reminder now about what really matters. Morgan nodded once, accepting the sentiment without false modesty or deflection. Then she returned to cleaning, and Thornton walked away, leaving her to finish the shift that would keep her son housed and fed and protected from the harsh realities his mother had survived so that he wouldn't have to. The Admiral spent that evening at home, unable to focus on the usual routine of dinner and television and preparation for the next day. His mind kept circling back to Morgan, to the 47 other Navy veterans in similar situations, to the systemic issues that created these outcomes. His wife, Patricia, noticed his distraction during dinner, asked what was troubling him. Thornton tried to explain, fumbling through the story of the janitor who'd been a legend, the warrior maintaining floors instead of leading missions. Patricia listened with the patient attention of someone who'd spent 30 years married to a man whose work often demanded emotional processing. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment, then said simply, "So help her. You have the power. Use it." It was characteristic of Patricia, cutting through complexity to identify the essential action required. Thornton smiled despite his troubled thoughts. It's not that simple. She doesn't want help that feels like charity. She's built a life that works, even if it doesn't utilize her full capabilities. Then create opportunities without making them about her specifically, Patricia suggested. You said there were dozens of others in similar situations. Build something systemic that helps everyone, that just happens to include her. That way it's not charity, it's institutional improvement. The solution was elegant, so obvious in retrospect that Thornton wondered why he hadn't seen it immediately. Stop focusing on Morgan as individual case requiring intervention. Start focusing on the population of medically retired special operations personnel as underutilized strategic resource. Frame it as capability retention rather than charity, as recognizing talent rather than rescuing victims. That night, Thornton revised his memo completely, transforming it from critique of Morgan's treatment into proposal for strategic talent retention initiative. The program would identify medically retired personnel with high-level clearances and operational experience, provide career counseling tailored to their specific expertise, and create partnerships with agencies and contractors seeking cleared personnel with tactical knowledge. No one would be singled out. No one would feel like they were receiving special consideration. The new memo was stronger, more persuasive, stripped of the emotional undercurrents that might have triggered defensive reactions from Navy bureaucracy. Thornton sent it to Captain Reese with instructions to begin formal routing through proper channels. It would take months to implement, assuming it was approved at all. But it was the right approach, sustainable and scalable in ways that individual intervention could never be. 3 weeks passed in the usual rhythm of Pentagon duties. Thornton attended briefings, made decisions, supervised operations that spanned oceans. He saw Morgan occasionally during evening walks through the West Wing, exchanged professional nods but didn't stop to talk. She was busy, he was busy, and the situation no longer felt fraught with the awkwardness of their initial encounter. They'd reached an understanding, unspoken but functional. Then came the Friday of the Veterans Transition Career Fair. Thornton made a point of attending, walking through the exhibition hall where dozens of agencies and contractors had set up recruiting tables. The DIA table was positioned prominently, staffed by a retired Army colonel who'd spent his career in special operations before transitioning to strategic advisory work. The colonel was good at his job, engaging with veterans who stopped by, asking intelligent questions about their experience and capabilities. Thornton loitered near the table, pretending to review his phone while actually observing. Morgan arrived at 13:30, dressed in business casual rather than her janitor's uniform, looking professional and competent in ways the uniform had obscured. She carried a folder that probably contained her resume and supporting documents, approached the DIA table with the same calm confidence that had once carried her through combat insertions. The conversation was too quiet for Thornton to hear specifics, but body language told the story. The colonel leaned forward, interested, asking questions that made Morgan's posture straighten with pride rather than defensiveness. She was explaining her background, probably navigating the tricky waters of discussing classified service without violating operational security. The colonel nodded repeatedly, made notes, eventually handed Morgan a business card and what looked like preliminary application materials. Thornton felt something unclench in his chest. This wasn't guaranteed. Morgan would still need to complete the application process, pass interviews, demonstrate that her skills translated to strategic advisory work. But it was a chance, a real opportunity that respected her capabilities without patronizing her circumstances. Whether she got the position or not, at least now she knew it existed, knew that someone valued what she'd done and what she could still contribute. The Admiral slipped out of the exhibition hall without approaching Morgan, without letting her know he'd been there. This was her journey now, her decision to make without his influence. He'd opened the door by ensuring the career fair happened and that DIA was properly represented. What Morgan did with that opportunity was entirely up to her, as it should be. Walking back through the Pentagon's endless corridors, Thornton reflected on how much had changed in 3 weeks. He'd encountered a janitor and discovered a warrior. He'd confronted his own assumptions about visibility and valor. He'd learned that sometimes the most important service happened in silence, and sometimes the greatest courage was required not for combat operations, but for the grinding daily battle of single parenthood while dealing with chronic pain and economic precarity. Morgan had taught him all of that without trying, simply by existing, by maintaining her dignity and discipline in circumstances that would have broken people with less strength. The lesson would stay with him for the rest of his career, informing how he thought about personnel management and institutional responsibility. Every janitor, every maintenance worker, every person the Pentagon's admirals and generals walked past without seeing, they all had stories, all had contributions that deserved recognition even if that recognition never came. Captain Reese was waiting in his office with news about the Strategic Talent Retention Initiative. The memo had been well received at multiple levels, with preliminary approval to develop a pilot program. It would start small, maybe 20 participants in the first cohort, but success could lead to expansion across all services. Morgan would be invited to participate if she wanted, along with the others Reese had identified. No special treatment, no indication that she'd inspired the program, just an opportunity extended to those who'd earned it through service and sacrifice. "This is good work, Captain," Thornton said, reviewing the approval documentation. "Really good work. These veterans deserve better than they've been getting." "Yes, sir," Reese agreed. "And if I may say so, you deserve credit for recognizing the need and pushing for systemic solution rather than individual intervention." Thornton shook his head. "I didn't do anything except finally see what was in front of me the whole time. Morgan did the hard part, serving with excellence, surviving impossible situations, then rebuilding her life when her body wouldn't let her continue. All I did was acknowledge that and try to create conditions where others might have more options than she did." The conversation turned to other matters, the thousand details that composed an admiral's workday. But as Thornton signed documents and reviewed reports, part of his mind remained focused on that exhibition hall, on Morgan talking with the DIA recruiter, on the possibility that maybe, finally, the system would work for someone who'd given everything in service to it. Evening came, and with it the end of another Pentagon workday. Thornton gathered his belongings, said goodnight to his aide, and began the walk to the parking garage. He detoured through the West Wing corridors one last time, old habit now, and found Morgan there as expected, finishing her shift. She looked up as he approached, and something in her expression made him pause. Not quite a smile, but a softening, an acknowledgement of connection between people who understood each other better than they had 3 weeks ago. "Admiral," she said simply. "Lieutenant Commander," he replied with equal formality. They stood there for a moment, the Admiral and the Janitor who'd been Night Eagle, both understanding that words would diminish whatever passed between them. Thornton nodded once, then continued toward the parking garage, leaving Morgan to finish her work. Behind him, he heard the quiet swish of her mop against tile, the sound of someone completing their mission with the same precision she'd once brought to impossible rescues. The next morning, Morgan woke at 4:30, the same time she'd risen for 7 years of operational flying, her body still programmed to that schedule despite 2 years of civilian work. Her son slept in the apartment's only bedroom while she'd made do with the couch, a temporary arrangement that had become permanent when her chronic back pain made sleeping on soft mattresses impossible anyway. The living room was small, cluttered with the accumulated evidence of their lives, her son's schoolwork covering the coffee table, his shoes by the door, laundry waiting to be folded on the chair she'd salvaged from a curb. She moved quietly through morning routine, conscious of not waking him before his alarm. Coffee brewed while she did the stretches her physical therapist had prescribed, working through exercises designed to manage the nerve damage that made her left leg occasionally go numb, the spinal compression that sent lightning up her back when she moved wrong. The pain was constant but manageable, part of her life's background noise like the traffic sounds from the street below. Morgan had grown up in rural Montana, daughter of a ranch foreman and a school teacher, neither of whom had understood when she'd announced her intention to join the Navy and fly helicopters. Flying wasn't for people like them, wasn't for girls from families who counted pennies and wore hand-me-downs. But Morgan had been determined, had worked 3 jobs to save money for college, had studied until her eyes burned to maintain the grades necessary for ROTC scholarship. The military had been her escape route, her pathway to something larger than the small town that felt like a cage. Flight school had been revelation and trial simultaneously. She'd loved every minute, the technical challenge of mastering complex aircraft systems, the physical demands of formation flying and night operations, the rush of bringing tons of metal under precise control. She'd been good at it, better than good, blessed with spatial intelligence and hand-eye coordination that instructors said was exceptional. But being a woman in a community dominated by men had required constant vigilance, constant proof that she belonged, that her success wasn't affirmative action but earned through genuine skill. The special operations community had been different. They cared less about gender than competence, less about politics than reliability. Morgan had found her place there, among operators who measured worth by performance under pressure rather than adherence to cultural norms. The call sign Night Eagle had come after a mission where she'd navigated through a mountain valley in complete darkness, infrared systems malfunctioning, flying by intuition and terrain memory to extract a team trapped by enemy contact. The Delta sergeant who'd coined the name said she flew like she had predator's eyes, seeing what others missed, moving through darkness like it was daylight. Those had been the best years of her life, even with the danger and stress. She'd felt useful, vital, part of something that mattered. Every mission meant someone came home who might otherwise have died. Every successful extraction validated her decision to join the Navy, to push through barriers and prove herself worthy of the trust operators placed in pilots who flew the rescues. Then came the mission outside Kandahar, the RPG that had detonated too close, the shrapnel that had turned her spinal column into a collection of fractures and compressed discs. She remembered the impact, the way her vision had gone white, the feeling of the helicopter bucking beneath her like a wounded animal. She remembered forcing herself to maintain control, to ignore the screaming pain, to get the aircraft and its crew back to friendly territory before surrendering to the damage. The months after had been worse than the injury itself. Surgery, recovery, physical therapy, then the slow realization that her body wouldn't heal enough to pass a flight physical. The inner ear damage was permanent, the vestibular dysfunction subtle but disqualifying for someone whose job required precise spatial orientation in degraded visual environments. She'd fought the medical board, argued that she could compensate, that her experience would outweigh the physical limitations. But regulations were regulations, and the Navy couldn't risk aircraft and crews on someone who might experience vertigo or disorientation during critical flight phases. The discharge had felt like death, like losing essential parts of her identity. She wasn't Night Eagle anymore, wasn't a pilot, wasn't even particularly healthy. She was just Morgan Avery, 29 years old, single mother to a toddler conceived during a brief relationship that hadn't survived her deployment schedule, medically retired with a pension that covered basic expenses but offered no path forward. She tried to find work that utilized her aviation background, training development, simulation consulting, operational planning. But those positions required connections she didn't have, networks she'd never built because she'd been too busy flying actual missions. The defense contractors wanted people with graduate degrees and beltway experience, not combat pilots who could barely walk without pain medication. Eventually, she'd taken the Pentagon janitorial position because it offered health insurance her son needed and stability their lives required. It wasn't what she'd envisioned when she'd left Montana full of dreams about flying and service. But it was honest work, and it kept them fed and housed, and that had to be enough because no amount of wishing would restore her health or change the circumstances that had brought her here. Her son woke at 5:30, stumbling into the living room rubbing sleep from his eyes. 12 years old, already nearly as tall as Morgan, with his father's height and her stubbornness. He was a good kid, mostly, struggled with focus sometimes, got frustrated when schoolwork didn't come easily, but fundamentally kind and curious about the world. "Morning, Mom," he mumbled, heading straight for the cereal cabinet. "Morning, baby. Remember you've got that math test today." He groaned theatrically. "I studied, I'm ready." Morgan smiled, knowing he probably hadn't studied as much as he should have, but also knowing that pushing him would only trigger teenage defensiveness. "Pick your battles," the parenting book said. "Save the hard confrontations for things that actually mattered." A mediocre grade on one math test wouldn't destroy his future, though she privately worried about his overall trajectory. about whether her limited resources and chronic exhaustion were adequate to give him the foundation he needed. They ate breakfast together in comfortable silence, both of them still waking up, neither requiring conversation to feel connected. Morgan had learned early in parenthood that some of the best moments were these quiet ones, just existing in the same space, no agenda beyond getting ready for the day ahead. After her son left for school, caught the bus that would take him across Arlington to the public school that was decent but not excellent, Morgan cleaned the apartment and prepared for another shift at the Pentagon. The career fair yesterday had been interesting, more promising than she'd expected. The DIA recruiter had seemed genuinely interested in her background, had asked intelligent questions about her operational experience and current clearances. He'd mentioned a strategic advisory role that sounded intriguing, consulting work on operational planning, using her tactical knowledge to help plan missions she'd never fly. It was worth pursuing, worth hopping for, even if hope felt dangerous after so many disappointments. Morgan had learned to protect herself by expecting little, by focusing on the present rather than imagining futures that might never materialize. But the DIA opportunity felt different, felt legitimate in ways that previous dead-end job inquiries hadn't. Maybe this time would be different. Maybe something was finally shifting in her favor. She arrived at the Pentagon at 1400, clocked in, collected her cleaning supplies from the maintenance office. The supervisor nodded greeting but didn't make conversation. Morgan was reliable, didn't cause problems, completed her assigned sections efficiently. That was all that mattered in this role, that and showing up consistently regardless of how much her back hurt or how exhausted she felt. The West Wing corridors were busier than usual, some kind of high-level conference drawing flag officers and their aides. Morgan worked around them, invisible as always, just another support worker keeping the facility functional while important people made important decisions. She'd long since stopped feeling bitter about the invisibility. It was freeing in some ways, being unseen, being able to move through spaces without the weight of expectations and judgment. Admiral Thornton appeared around 1530, walking with his characteristic purposeful stride. He nodded to Morgan as he passed, the same neutral acknowledgement he'd been offering since their last conversation 3 weeks ago. No special attention, no indication of any connection beyond basic professional courtesy. Morgan appreciated that, appreciated being treated normally rather than with the pity or awkward fascination that sometimes came when people learned about her background. She finished her shift at 2200, exhausted but satisfied with another day completed, another paycheck earned toward rent and groceries and her son's future. The bus ride home took 40 minutes, long enough to decompress, to transition from work mode to parent mode. Her son was asleep when she arrived, homework scattered across the kitchen table, evidence that he'd at least attempted his assignments before surrendering to exhaustion. Morgan smiled despite her tiredness, cleaned up the homework mess, checked that his backpack was ready for tomorrow. Then she collapsed onto the couch that served as her bed, body aching in ways that would worsen before morning came. But she'd survived another day, kept their small family functioning, maintained the discipline that had once made her night eagle even if now it just made her a janitor who showed up on time and worked efficiently. Sleep came quickly, dreamless and deep, the kind of rest earned through physical labor and managed pain. Tomorrow would bring another shift, another day of keeping their lives together through determination and refusal to surrender. It wasn't the life she'd imagined, wasn't the future she'd hoped for when she'd left Montana determined to fly. But it was hers, built from scratch after everything else had been taken away, and that counted for something even if no one else recognized its value. 2 weeks after the career fair, Morgan received a call from the DIA recruiter. His voice over the phone was professional but warm, inviting her to interview for the strategic advisory consultancy position. The interview would be extensive, multiple rounds, various panel members, deep dives into her operational experience within the constraints of what could be discussed in secure facilities. It would require taking time off from the Pentagon, arranging childcare for hours when she'd normally be home, preparing responses to questions about missions she'd spent years learning not to discuss. But it was a chance, a real one, and Morgan found herself wanting it with an intensity that surprised her. She'd thought she'd made peace with her current circumstances, had accepted that flying days were over and janitorial work was her reality. But the possibility of using her tactical knowledge again, of contributing expertise rather than just maintaining facilities, awakened something she'd thought was dead: ambition, professional pride, the desire to be recognized for capabilities rather than just accepted for reliable service. The first interview happened on a Tuesday, conducted in a DIA facility in Bethesda that required her to pass through multiple security checkpoints and surrender her phone. The panel consisted of 3 people: the Army colonel from the career fair, a former Air Force pararescue officer, and a civilian analyst who'd spent 30 years in various intelligence roles. They asked about her flying background, her tactical decision-making processes, how she'd handled specific types of operational challenges. Morgan answered carefully, walking the line between demonstrating expertise and protecting classified information. She described approaches to mountain flying in degraded visual environments, explained her methodology for rapid threat assessment during extractions, discussed how she'd built situational awareness when electronic systems failed. The panel listened intently, occasionally interrupting with follow-up questions that revealed their own operational backgrounds and tactical sophistication. "Tell us about Cunnar Valley," the Air Force officer said, referencing the mission Admiral Thornton had mentioned. "Without violating OPSEC, what made that extraction possible when the conventional assessment said it was impossible?" Morgan took a moment to organize her thoughts, aware that her answer would reveal much about her tactical philosophy and risk tolerance. The conventional assessment was based on aircraft performance parameters under normal conditions, but I've been flying that specific helicopter for 18 months, knew its capabilities intimately, understood how much I could exceed standard limitations for short periods. The valley downdrafts were severe, but I'd encountered similar conditions in training scenarios and knew the aircraft could handle the stress if I managed power precisely. She paused, remembering the mission with crystalline clarity, the way the helicopter had shuddered under the turbulence, the tracers arcing up from enemy positions, the desperate faces of the SEALs waiting on that ridge. The enemy fire was the bigger problem, but they were using small arms primarily, some RPGs. I studied the terrain, identified approach corridors that would minimize exposure time, used terrain masking wherever possible. The last insertion was highest risk because they'd figured out my pattern. But by then we only had one load left, and accepting the risk was worth ensuring everyone got out. The civilian analyst leaned forward. "You took 14 hits on that final approach. At what point did you consider aborting the extraction?" "Never, ma'am." Morgan met the analyst's eyes steadily. "Those men were trapped and I was their only option for extraction. Aborting would have meant leaving them to die. That wasn't acceptable." The panel exchanged glances, some unspoken communication passing between them. The Army colonel made a note, then asked, "How do you assess risk differently now, given your medical limitations? Would you make the same decisions or has your perspective changed?" It was a perceptive question, one that acknowledged her current status while probing whether she retained the operational mindset they valued. Morgan considered her answer carefully. "My risk tolerance hasn't changed in terms of willingness to accept danger for important objectives, but I'm more aware now of physical limitations, of the importance of sustainable operations rather than relying on individual heroics. If I were advising on that mission now, I'd probably recommend having a backup aircraft ready, ensuring the pilot had rest before the operation, building in contingencies for equipment failure. Not because the risk wasn't worth it, but because proper planning reduces the need for last-minute heroics." The interview continued for 2 hours, covering operational scenarios, decision-making frameworks, how she'd handled command relationships with various special operations units. Morgan found herself energized despite the intensity, her mind working in ways it hadn't for years, tactical analysis and strategic thinking flowing naturally despite the long gap since her flying days. When the interview ended, the panel thanked her professionally but gave no indication of their assessment. Standard procedure, Morgan knew, but frustrating nonetheless. She left the facility uncertain whether she'd performed well or poorly, whether her answers had demonstrated continued relevance or merely highlighted how far she'd drifted from operational aviation. The second interview came a week later, this time focused more on analytical capabilities, reviewing hypothetical mission scenarios, identifying potential risks, recommending tactical adjustments to improve success probability. Morgan tackled each scenario methodically, drawing on years of operational experience to spot the details that less experienced planners might miss. The hidden risks in terrain analysis, the weather factors that would affect aircraft performance, the psychological considerations of how operators would respond to specific tactical situations. This panel seemed more impressed, asking increasingly complex questions, testing the limits of her tactical knowledge. By the end, Morgan felt cautiously optimistic. She demonstrated that her skills remained sharp despite years away from actual operations, that her ability to think tactically hadn't atrophied during the transition to civilian work. The final interview was with the program director, a former SEAL who transitioned to intelligence analysis after his own medical retirement. He spent less time on tactical questions and more on practical considerations. Her availability, her willingness to handle potentially irregular hours, how she'd balance consulting work with single parenthood. "This position isn't 9 to 5, he explained, his tone matter-of-fact rather than apologetic. "Sometimes crises emerge and we need rapid analysis. Sometimes you'll spend weeks with minimal contact followed by intense periods requiring daily input. It demands flexibility, which I know is complicated with a child." Morgan nodded, appreciating his directness. "My son is 12, fairly independent. I have backup childcare arrangements for emergencies. Obviously, I can't predict every contingency, but I'm prepared to meet the position's demands while maintaining my parental responsibilities." The director studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. "I'll be honest, Lieutenant Commander. Your tactical knowledge is exceptional, and your operational background is exactly what we need for certain planning scenarios. But I'm concerned about sustainability. You've been out of the aviation community for 2 years, working a job that doesn't utilize your capabilities. Sometimes people in that situation romanticize returning to tactical work without fully considering the psychological demands." It was a fair concern, one Morgan had considered herself during sleepless nights. "I won't pretend the transition would be easy. I've spent 2 years deliberately not thinking about missions, not engaging with the tactical analysis that used to define my professional identity. Coming back to it would require adjustment." She paused, choosing her next words carefully. "But I'm good at this, sir. Not just competent, but genuinely skilled in ways that don't disappear just because I'm not actively flying. My mind still works tactically, still sees patterns and risks that others miss. This position would give me opportunity to contribute that expertise in ways my current work doesn't allow. I want that, not because I'm romanticizing it, but because I understand what I can offer and value the chance to use those capabilities again." The director's expression shifted slightly, showing something that might have been approval. "All right, we'll make a final decision within 2 weeks. Regardless of outcome, I want you to know that we were impressed by your performance throughout this process. You're clearly an exceptional tactical thinker, and I hope we can find a way to utilize that expertise." Morgan left that final interview feeling emotionally wrung out but hopeful. She'd done everything possible to demonstrate her qualifications, had answered every question honestly while advocating for herself without arrogance. Now came the hardest part, waiting, continuing her normal life while wondering if everything might be about to change. The 2 weeks passed slowly, each day bringing renewed uncertainty. Morgan pushed her cleaning cart through Pentagon corridors, scrubbed floors, and emptied trash, all while her mind spun through possibilities and contingencies. If she got the position, she'd need to arrange new childcare, find professional clothes suitable for an office environment, adjust to a completely different work schedule. If she didn't get it, she'd need to accept that her tactical career was truly over, that no amount of expertise would overcome the gap between her current circumstances and the professional opportunities she craved. Admiral Thornton appeared occasionally during those 2 weeks, always offering the same neutral nod, never asking about her job prospects or indicating any knowledge of her interview process. Morgan appreciated his discretion even as she wondered whether he knew, whether he'd somehow been involved in creating the opportunity she'd interviewed for. But those were questions without answers, speculation that served no purpose beyond distracting her from the waiting. On day 13, her phone rang during lunch break. The DIA number appeared on her screen and Morgan's heart rate spiked. This was it, acceptance or rejection, opportunity or disappointment. She answered on the second ring, keeping her voice steady despite the adrenaline surge. "Ms. Avery, this is Director Harrison from DIA Strategic Advisory Consultancy. I'm calling to offer you a position with our team, assuming you're still interested in joining us." The words hit like a physical force, relief and joy and terror mixing together until Morgan couldn't distinguish individual emotions. "Yes, sir, I'm definitely still interested. Thank you for this opportunity." "Excellent. We'll need to process your final clearance updates and handle administrative details, but we'd like you to start in 3 weeks if that timeline works for your current obligations. The formal offer letter will arrive via email within 24 hours, including salary details and benefit information." 3 weeks. Morgan's mind immediately began calculating logistics, giving notice at the Pentagon, arranging new childcare, preparing her son for the changes ahead. It was manageable barely, assuming nothing went catastrophically wrong. "That timeline works, sir. I'll watch for the offer letter and respond promptly." "Looking forward to working with you, Lieutenant Commander. Welcome to the team." The call ended, leaving Morgan sitting alone in the Pentagon break room, hands trembling slightly as the full weight of what had just happened settled over her. She'd gotten the job. After 2 years of pushing mops and emptying trash, after countless nights wondering if she'd ever do meaningful work again, she'd gotten the job. Her tactical expertise would matter again. Her operational experience would contribute to missions that actually impacted outcomes. Her identity as Night Eagle would mean something beyond a classified file gathering dust. Morgan allowed herself exactly 60 seconds of pure celebration, sitting there with a smile she couldn't suppress, feeling lighter than she had in years. Then she pulled herself together, stood up, threw away her lunch trash, and returned to work. She still had 2 more weeks of shifts to complete, still had responsibilities to fulfill regardless of what came next. The discipline that had made her an exceptional pilot would carry her through this transition just as it had carried her through everything else. That evening, she told her son about the new job. He was excited and nervous in equal measure, proud that his mom was doing something important but worried about how the changes might affect their routine. Morgan reassured him as best she could, explaining that yes, things would be different, but they'd figure it out together the same way they'd figured out everything else. They were a team, the two of them, and they'd survived worse than a job transition. Over the following days, Morgan gave notice at the Pentagon, worked her final shifts, said goodbye to colleagues who'd never known she was anything beyond a competent janitor. Most of them wished her well with generic pleasantness, unaware that she was transitioning from pushing a mop to advising on special operations missions. But that was fine. Morgan had never needed external validation, had learned long ago that true worth wasn't measured by others' perceptions, but by her own understanding of what she'd accomplished and could still contribute. Admiral Thornton appeared during Morgan's final shift, finding her in the West Wing corridor where they'd first spoken 3 months earlier. This time, his expression held something warmer than professional courtesy, respect, perhaps, or acknowledgement of a journey completed. "Lieutenant Commander Avery," he said formally, "I heard through unofficial channels that you're moving on to other opportunities. I wanted to wish you well." Morgan met his gaze steadily, seeing the unspoken knowledge there. He'd known about the DIA position, probably had helped create the opportunity even if his involvement couldn't be acknowledged. "Thank you, Admiral. I appreciate everything you've done, officially and otherwise." Thornton nodded slightly, accepting her thanks without deflecting or playing political games. "The Navy was lucky to have you when we did, even if we didn't always recognize it properly. I suspect DIA is about to discover what we lost." The compliment landed with weight, validation from someone whose opinion actually mattered in the warrior community Morgan had once inhabited. She'd flown missions that would remain classified for decades, had earned her call sign through actions that would never be publicly acknowledged. But Admiral Thornton knew, understood, and respected what she'd done. That counted for something, maybe everything. "I was lucky to serve, sir. Despite how it ended, I'm grateful for the opportunity the Navy gave me." "That generosity of spirit is rare, Lieutenant Commander. Don't lose it in your new position. The intelligence community can be cynical. They need people who remember why we do this work, who maintain faith in the mission even when systems fail individual operators." Morgan promised she would remember, then finished her final shift, cleaned her last floor, turned in her equipment to the maintenance office. Walking out of the Pentagon that night, no longer an employee but not yet settled into her new role, she felt suspended between identities. No longer just the janitor, not quite yet the strategic analyst, forever Night Eagle even if the call sign had been retired. Her new life began 3 weeks later with orientation at DIA headquarters, introduction to colleagues who treated her as professional equal rather than invisible support staff. The work was challenging, diving back into tactical analysis after years away, rebuilding mental frameworks for assessing operational risks and planning mission support. But Morgan found herself energized by the challenge, her mind waking up after a long hibernation, engaging with problems that actually utilized her capabilities. Her son adjusted to their new routine with the resilience children possess when they feel secure in their parents' love. Yes, things were different. Mom worked different hours, seemed more energized but also more exhausted in different ways. But the fundamentals remained unchanged. They were still a team, still facing life together, still building a future from whatever material circumstances provided. Months passed, then a year. Morgan established herself as valuable team member, her tactical insights earning respect from colleagues who'd initially been skeptical about someone who'd been out of operational aviation for 3 years. She worked on planning scenarios for missions she'd never see, provided analysis that would contribute to operations she'd never know the outcomes of. It was strange, being involved in special operations work without actually flying the missions, but it was meaningful in ways janitorial work had never been. She thought sometimes about that corridor conversation with Admiral Thornton, about the moment when being seen had changed everything. Not because he'd rescued her, Morgan rejected that narrative, but because he'd recognized what was being wasted and created conditions where waste could be corrected. The Admiral had done for her what the system should have done automatically, ensured that warriors who could no longer fight physically could still contribute tactically. The strategic talent retention initiative that Thornton had championed eventually became Navy policy, expanded to include all services, providing pathways for medically retired personnel to transition into consulting and advisory roles that valued their expertise. Morgan learned about the program months after starting her DIA position, realized with quiet satisfaction that her story had catalyzed something larger than individual intervention. Other veterans would benefit from opportunities she'd had to discover through chance encounter, and one Admiral's recognition of systemic failure. 2 years after leaving the Pentagon janitorial position, Morgan attended a veteran appreciation ceremony where Admiral Thornton was speaking. She sat in the audience, anonymous among hundreds of other former service members, listening as he talked about the importance of recognizing all forms of service, about ensuring that warriors who sacrificed health and career for their missions received support commensurate with their contributions. He didn't mention her by name. Operational security prevented that, and Morgan didn't want public recognition anyway. But she heard the echo of their conversations in his words, recognized the influence of her story on his thinking about how the military should support its wounded and injured personnel. It was enough, more than enough, knowing that her experience had meaning beyond her individual circumstances. After the ceremony, Morgan approached Thornton briefly, shook his hand, thanked him for his advocacy. He smiled, the expression genuine, and said simply, "You earned this, Lieutenant Commander. All I did was make sure people saw what was always there. Night Eagle flies again, just in different ways." The words stayed with Morgan as she returned to her life, working the job that utilized her capabilities, raising her son who was growing into a thoughtful teenager, building a future that looked nothing like what she'd imagined but somehow felt right anyway. She'd been a warrior in the shadows, had earned a call sign that spoke to excellence in darkness, had survived injuries that ended one career only to eventually find another path forward. Her story wasn't unique. Thousands of veterans navigated similar transitions, faced similar challenges, rebuilt lives from fragments after service took everything and gave back inadequate compensation. But maybe her story had made subsequent stories slightly easier, had helped create systems where recognition and opportunity weren't dependent on chance encounters with admirals who happened to ask the right questions. Years would pass, then decades. Morgan would grow older, her son would become an adult and start his own family. The missions she'd flown would be slowly declassified and studied by historians trying to understand how special operations actually functioned during America's longest wars. Maybe someday her name would be attached to those mission reports. Maybe Night Eagle would be recognized publicly for the extraordinary pilot who'd saved dozens of operators through skill and courage that defied conventional limitations. Or maybe not. Maybe the classifications would hold for 50 years, 75, maybe forever. Maybe Morgan Avery would remain unknown except to the people who'd been there, who'd seen what she could do, who'd trusted their lives to her judgment and been rewarded with survival. Either way, she'd lived with honor, served with distinction, survived circumstances that would have broken people with less strength, and built a life that mattered to the people she loved. Night Eagle had flown through darkness, seen what others couldn't, brought warriors home from impossible situations. That legacy endured regardless of whether anyone remembered the woman behind the call sign. And in the end, that was enough, to have served well, to have mattered in the moments that counted, to have been seen by the people whose recognition actually meant something. Admiral Thornton had given Morgan that final gift, being truly seen, not as janitor or victim or tragedy, but as the warrior she'd always been and would always remain. Everything else that followed was just the natural consequence of recognition meeting opportunity, of systems working the way they should have all along. The story ended not with dramatic rescue or public ceremony, but with quiet satisfaction of a life rebuilt on warrior principles applied to civilian challenges. Morgan pushed no more mops, but she maintained the same discipline, the same commitment to excellence, the same refusal to surrender regardless of obstacles. Night Eagle had taught her how to see in darkness, And that skill served her just as well in the ordinary shadows of everyday life as it once had in the extraordinary darkness of combat operations. She'd survived, adapted, overcome. And in doing so, she'd reminded one admiral and eventually an entire system that warriors came in many forms, that service took many shapes, and that the most important recognition wasn't public acclaim but the quiet acknowledgement from people who understood what excellence actually required. That recognition, once given, sustained her through everything that followed, the hard days and the good ones, the struggles and the victories, the long journey from anonymous janitor back to something approaching the warrior she'd always been inside.